is such a pleasure to be able to chat with you today. Thank you for making time to be here. And I'm super excited to talk about your book that came out earlier this year, When You Care, The Unexpected Magic of Caring for Others. Um, I want you to introduce yourself, but first I will just say I've been reading through not only your book, but also the archives of your journalistic writing, and you are an amazing writer. I'm sure that
Thank
people
you.
tell you that all the time, but it's really a delight. It's been a delight to read you. So thank you for your work. Um, but
Thank you. I will say
yeah.
people don't say it so much that when someone like you says it, it's not deeply meaningful to me. So thank you.
No, it's like a nice blend of like journalist reporting, but also literary. So
Oh,
I've
thanks.
appreciated it. So why don't you just introduce yourself so folks know kind of what you do and who you are and all those types of things.
Of course. So yeah, my name's Elissa Strauss. I am a writer who, as you already explained, likes to merge reporting with criticism, with memoir, because that's how I best understand the world, and that's how I hope to help others understand the world. I've been writing about the intersection of motherhood, feminism, politics, and culture for a very long time. Was recently described in the podcast "The Mother of It All" as part of the older generation of moms. So that can I was like, the first I've been told that, but it's true. My oldest is 12 now. So I've been doing this for a long time, and this book really came from writing about these issues in a more piecemeal fashion for 5, 6 years and feeling like I wanted to really dig deeper into the subject.
Awesome. Well, it you can tell the reader can tell just the depth and breadth of how much you've been in this world of care, not only personally but also from a research standpoint. I mean, you talk to like all of the luminaries, Ai-jen Poo, Bridget Schulte, like you've rounded up everybody to get sort of like a really deep synopsis. And I think, I feel like care is sort of like it's like a little bit in vogue now, maybe because it's like, finally if things go um the way that I'm hoping they go in November, we'll have finally some care infrastructure that comes through. Uh and uh for folks here that have been subscribers to the newsletter, you know that I recently hosted the panel on care versus parenting and do the words matter. And I think it seems like the work that folks like Ai-jen Poo and Bridget Schulte and, the folks that have been doing this for like decades and decades and decades, it's like finally maybe starting to come out a little bit as like, oh, this is a thing. Um, but what I love about how you talk about it is that you're kind of bringing this, kind of like this like positive lens to it. Um, so I'd love for you to maybe just like riff a little bit on like how you see the thread that you follow of care, because there's so much about like how hard it is, but I see like that word magic, right? The magic of caregiving. Like I'd love to hear you share how you think about that.
Yeah, and I'll start with the little genesis of the book. So, as I mentioned, I've been writing a lot about why we don't have paid leave, and other such policies for so long. And I reached a point where I felt like I could not write one more paid leave story. They need to be written. We need to be shouting it from the rooftops until we get a good policy. But there was something, I hit a point where I was like, there's something deeper going on here. The care crisis isn't just political, because if it was, like, come on, this is the most intuitive thing in the world to be able to stay home and care for yourself or a child after childbirth, or you're, someone in your family is sick, to be able to be with them. Like, how do we not have a society that protects care? And so I decided I needed to dig deeper and see the cultural roots of the care crisis and understand how care was rendered, in my opinion, a footnote in the human story instead of the major plot point that it really is. And as part of that, I really noticed that for a long time we had the fairy tale version of care, and that was the idealized, sentimentalized version of care where it's just a sweet, harmonious space where a mother or woman is caring for children or the old elder disabled individuals that need their care, and everything is sweet and she's totally attuned to them and has no needs herself. I always think of Virgin Mary, how many paintings I've seen with Mary and Jesus, and I always like, Mary's arm is tired, like she's sitting there for thousands of years holding this baby. I was like, someone take the baby, get her a cup of coffee.
Mary needs one of
Um,
those like breastfeeding pillows that we have now where you can
Totally.
prop
Yes,
the baby up, right?
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And a Netflix remote control in the right hand. Yeah.
Yes,
So
yes.
no, listen, also we should look at our babies. I don't think we but it's like it's this one version of care. So we had that forever. And then we have this other version of care that was the correction, and rightly so, of like the kind of the harder parts of care. And I felt like missing was this messy middle, that this deeply meaningful, messy middle, which was hard and challenging, but also had those joyful moments. But above all, was a place where we really forged our identities and who we are and our understanding of life and created deep meaning. And so that, when I talk about like the joy or the magic of care in the book, it's not simple happiness because care is way too real and rich and hard and crazy and big to just be, a happy-go-lucky experience. That was a lie. Thank God we've started to leave that behind in the 20th century. But moving forward, I think we need to see it in its richness and breadth. And that's what I was really inspired to dig into in the book. And that's frankly what I experienced in my own life as a mom. I went into motherhood really unambivalent about having kids, and also was lucky enough I didn't have any postpartum depression. I can't say I enjoyed the first like 6 months of parenthood with either of my kids, but I hung in, I did the work, and what I found when that care was so much more enriching psychologically, intellectually, and spiritually than I had anticipated. And I really went into motherhood thinking I kind of had to protect myself from care, that it would make me less interesting or cool in literary circles in Brooklyn, New York, where I lived back in 2012. And when I discovered that it had this whole other dimension to it, it made me want to write about it. And not because I am the perfect mother by kind of external standards, or certainly not by like Instagram parenting standards, but I have skin in the game. I feel like it's doing things to me. And I had so many questions about that, and I wanted to explore it.
You wrote this great piece for I think it was for Slate about how it was almost like a coming out about how you enjoy being a mom and how deeply uncomfortable that is to talk about socially these days because so much of the especially online the conversation is sort of like how hard it is and um I'm just going to read a little excerpt from that if that's okay because I thought it was
Of
such a
course.
great piece. um You say to insist on motherhood as a path to meaning, purpose, let alone joy, can feel like I'm doing the bidding of conservative forces in our culture who don't just advocate for embracing motherhood, but a return to patriarchal domestic structure in which dad. Oh, I missed a little bit. Well, return to patriarchal domestic structure. This disquiet lingers even in solitude, particularly when I'm reading smart writing by smart women, in which motherhood is presented as something that limits or subtracts. It's not that I have a problem with that feeling that way or writing about it. I don't expect anyone to feel the same as I do about this relationship or any of my other relationships, including my relationship with my parents or my husband. The problem isn't that I feel unseen so much as I often detect an unspoken assessment that intelligence and motherhood are incompatible, or as the case in many fictional portraits of maternal ambivalence, a feeling that being honest about one's desires and seeking them out can't happen in the context of caring for one's kids. To like motherhood makes me dumb and repressed, I temporarily conclude, cheeks on fire, even though nobody is watching. I thought that was just such a beautiful portrait of I think the predicament that mothers and women are in, especially today in 2024. Um, I when I was preparing for this conversation, I saw that you conceived through IVF, right?
Yeah, Levi, my
Yeah.
second, was IVF
Yes.
baby. Yeah.
Yes. And I had my son, who's now almost 2.5. I had him through IVF, a little bit later than you, I think, because I am now 41. But I and it's interesting because you've written and spoken about how you weren't ambivalent about motherhood, and I was deeply ambivalent about motherhood. And so I think I like live in this place where I'm always worried about, because the baby stage was very difficult. And now as my son has become a toddler, I am enjoying it more. I mean, the lows are very low, but the highs are a lot higher. It's so fun to watch him become a person and be in the world. But I find myself sort of couching it and not wanting to offend um, folks who've made different decisions, and also not wanting to come off as like too um, Pollyanna about it. And so you writing this really like spoke to me. I think this is a nice segue. In When You Care, you talk a lot about ambition and how we need to expand the definition of ambition to not just be, you know, the glass ceiling in corporate America, but also giving ourselves permission to bring ambition, not in like the Instagram version of ambition to motherhood, but like a different version. Can
Yeah.
you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it really goes back to second wave feminism, which became in its most prominent version, right, about women becoming more like men. I want to be so clear that I love all my feminist godmothers. Care and domestic life was often kind of a prison for women. They weren't wrong. Both of my grandmothers died in poverty, needing to rely on their children because they were caregivers. So there was something there. Like, I'm glad, I like that. I say I love abortion. I love the fact that I can have a credit card. I can divorce my husband. That I enjoyed premarital sex without cultural guilt. Like, I love all these gifts. I have a career. I love my career. It's deeply important to me. But so much of the vision of women's liberation was leaving behind the home, leaving behind care. Probably necessary considering the state of oppression women were in. But I really think we're at this moment now when we can reintegrate the care, we can reintegrate the motherhood, we can reintegrate domestic life, which may include, I like arranging a throw pillow, it's like that feels authentic to myself, that we can reintegrate these things and see them all part of something that we may label as ambitious or a meaningful life. And I just think this is such a moment, important moment for doing that work at last of really untangling care from the patriarchy and finding the good in care. Because I don't buy this notion that, men basically from the Industrial Revolution on, and this wasn't, of course, true for working class women, but it's the story, it's kind of our cultural narrative that men were doing the important work outside the home. And that was a place of money and power and reason and intellect. And women were home and they were doing the care. And it was kind of a simpler version of life, was innocent and sweet. Like, I don't buy that. I think that care that women did belongs as it in the hierarchy of importance, like right alongside the professional self, the ambitious, economically ambitious self, the power seeking self. And what I want, what my dream is, and I think with enough moral and cultural imagination, we can get there, is for all of us to integrate those sides. So to let go of a vision of women's empowerment that puts care under power and money and lift it up to right beside it. And in the process, hopefully, get more men and to do that care too, because they see it as part of a meaningful life.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to come back to that thread of men. But first, I'm so curious. How did you come to these realizations?
So I think it really started with Augie. He's going to be
Mm,
12 in a few weeks. And it took around, maybe around the age of your son. He, really, when he started really talking, I say that's when parenthood really turned on for me. I am a writer. I love words, I love exchanging ideas and feelings. And it started with a realization that is the simplest thing, but truly also the most profound thing. And I think if more people in the States had it right now and the world overall, we would be in a much better place. And it is the realization that other people are different than us, that
mm,
we go through the world seeing it as we are, right? And they're going through the world seeing it as they are. And really, nothing brought me closer to that truth than care, the relationship of care. And really realizing like it was up to me to not just pull this child into my vision of the world, my vision of reality, but do my best to understand how they see things. And I found that such a deep philosophical awakening, and something that I had tried to pursue through all these like epiphany seeking experiences, try to really enter a new reality, whether I did psychedelics or went on a meditation retreat or hiked a tall mountain or, backpacked across, continents, all this stuff I did where I was like, I'm going to find the meaning of life. I'm glad I did all those. I'm glad I had the opportunity to do all those. But nothing hit me as hard as like really one day. I remember there was one day I was pushing Augie home in a stroller from a music class and not understanding why he would sit totally silent during the whole class while every other kid was singing. And then on the way home, sing all the songs, and
mm,
we know, right? Like toddlers have all these quirks. But just to like stop myself, I was like, you know what? I don't get it. But like he gets it. What's that all about? And everything kind of took off from there. It created a curiosity about care and what it's like to be the person caring in the relationship that led to the whole book. And I feel like for so long, we've seen in care relationships that like the recipient of the care is the variable, the person who's moved and shaped by care. And the person giving the care is like the fix factor. They're just, it's
mm,
like the current only flows one way. And I had this moment, I was like, oh, the current is flowing both ways. And I want to understand myself better in this relationship. And, I did that by speaking to many people who care. And I also did it by digging into research because that's my instincts.
mhm. Um, well, thank you for sharing that. I was reminded as you were speaking of a couple different things. One being, there's been so many times in my own therapy where my psychoanalyst has pointed out that there is a two-way street between our personal lives and our family lives and our professional lives, like the private and public coexist. And the times when I've felt kind of the most stuck professionally, it's actually a change that needs to happen in my personal
Mm,
life. And that shift then leads to uh the unfolding of whatever needed to happen professionally. And I think as you were talking, I was imagining that or associating to that in my mind. I think maybe because of the way that you're kind of describing this insight you had, that it's not just about the 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 child or the elderly person or the person that's ill. It's about the person that's doing the care. Like there's a parallel process going on. um and it's so much more. I think the other thing that I was thinking about is that when we're talking about sort of like which direction women go in, as if it's only two directions, right? There's so many directions, but it comes back to like agency, right? It comes back
hmm
to, no matter what we're talking about, whether it's like reproductive rights or whether it's like the decision to become a parent, the decision, any of these things or where to focus your energy. Um, it works when it's of your own volition.
Yes.
And when you have the time and space to reflect and figure out what what you want, which to be fair is certainly a luxury these days to have that
Absolutely.
time
Yeah.
and space. Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, I think that that's really, it's like such a nice way to think about um, the way that our lives unfold and sort of how um, the relationships we have with our children and our own parents too are are continuing our journey. One of the things that I've been thinking about too is I'm working on my second book and like uh just this idea of this is off the subject, but how we like place so much emphasis on the choices that we make, let's say in the first like 30 years of our life, as if those are all the big decisions. And then after
Yeah.
that, it's just like, all right, you get what you get. Whereas in
Right.
reality, like there's so much more to be decided and so many different twists and turns that come, whether they're, you know, expected or unexpected. And so anyway, I was just thinking
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah. And so many of those are in our relationships, right? Because
Right. And
that's,
in caregiving, right. Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's,
Maybe
we
this
can't
is a
script
good
it.
spot.
Yeah.
No, we can't script it. We can't script
Yeah.
it. I want to make sure that I want you to talk about the Charles Darwin story. Um I loved reading that in the book and it kind of ties into what you were saying earlier about how care actually it's not a footnote, it's actually one of the main plot points. Can you walk us through what you learned about
Yeah.
him?
And so, yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, I think part of when I was having my own care epiphanies and my frustration with the world for not like acknowledging caregivers and parents by way of really important care policies, I kind of took a moment and I was like, let me think. I took economics 101, philosophy 101, evolution 101, all these 101s. I was an English major. And it's like, where was care? Absent. Um, so, right, one of those places where I was like, was in evolution of humans. How did we get here? And I think most of us, we have a kind of casual idea about evolution. We think of Charles Darwin and survival of the fittest and competition. And I went digging and I read more about Darwin. I read more of Darwin's work, but particularly was fascinated by his life story, that he himself was a very active father. And it was common, actually, fathers' roles have ebbed and flowed throughout history. So in the Victorian era, like fathers actually were oftentimes, he was not unusual for his generation to be more emotionally involved with his kids. But his personal story that actually impacted his theories was that his favorite daughter, Anne, who was a deeply loving, good person, died at the age of 10 from what we think may now we today we may think it was tuberculosis, but they're not sure. And the grief was heavy. It was very heavy for him, and it lasted a long time. He had so many questions. Where did Anne's goodness come from? Right? Charles Darwin did not believe in a divine creator. He did not think that's where goodness came from, but he saw kind of goodness in humans, and the mystery was profound for him. Also, why was he grieving her 30 years later or whatever? What evolutionary utility did that happen that wasn't making him stronger, more able to compete for resources? And this deeply raw emotional experience fed ultimately his theories. And he didn't just believe, this is the big punchline here, right? Like, he didn't just believe in survival of the fittest, he also believed in survival of the most sympathetic. And the way he used sympathy is something we might call care today, and the way we use care today. That humans didn't survive as a species just because they were in competition for resources and the strongest would win. They survived because they cared for each other, because we can't make it on our own. It is as important to the competition piece. And for Darwin, this sympathy, this care was rooted in the parental instinct, basically, that there's wired into that something called a parental instinct. And I want to be clear, any thinker I trust separates this idea of a parental instinct from our kind of loaded garbage ideas of the maternal instinct that are in
Mm,
circulation today. But this kind of raw instinct to care and provide, also, as we know now from the work of the anthropologist and evolutionary thinker Sarah Blaffer Hardy, happened within the structure of alloparents, right? We cared in networks, not as individuals. But back to Darwin, right? This like sympathy, this care is rooted in our instinct to care for small beings. And I think the quickest, easiest way is, not all of us are dog lovers, but if we are, we see a puppy with those big eyes and it's a little fluffy fur, and we just go like, oh, we want to care for this dog, even though we bring puppies into their house, in our houses, and they kind of ruin our lives for 6 months. They're like, but we can't help it because we see their faces. Their faces are like truly they hijack our care systems. I mean, 100%. Particularly these new doodle one. I have one with the big eyes. They look like they hijack our care instinct. So we have this, and for Darwin, this was just side by side with competition, and is really the story of our history of survival. But it got written out of our understanding, as did cooperation overall, evolutionary thinking, because of course our understanding of science is always colored by the political and cultural reality. And I was born in 1979, like I was raised in Reaganomics era, and that was chief competition time. We didn't want to think about ourselves as collective and cooperative. We didn't want to think about sympathy. We focused on competition because competition ultimately serves the capitalist narrative better. And it's just this whole story that we're missing of our understanding of ourselves as humans, that I think if we really had it, we would understand that we need things like paid leave. It would be the most intuitive, obvious thing in the world, and not a handout for people who can't get it together to, take care of their families. That should be an individual responsibility.
yeah. And it's so powerful that it's Darwin, I think, too, because he comes with all of the sort of trappings, fantastical trappings of like, the smart, erudite man.
Yeah.
Um, so in When You Care, you devote a lot of time to talking about men actually, and how we need to, if we want to move in this direction of care as something that is thought of as generative and worthwhile, um, that it means that men need to come to it because it's worth doing, not just because their partners are annoyed with them for not doing it.
Yeah.
um, can you talk a little bit more about like what you think it should look like and what is possible when men sort of see, and of course we're talking about in this, kind of like heterosexual partnership, cisgendered heterosexual partnership, but what have you seen in folks that you interviewed for the book? Like what have you seen as possible?
Yeah. I think first and foremost, I've seen from the male caregivers who share their personal care stories with me, um, their capacity to really be changed by care and to try on different selves than maybe traditional masculine culture would not let them. Like it's a place to be vulnerable. And you write so beautifully about vulnerability. And I think for men, like you cannot care well if you yourself aren't vulnerable. And not just you're accepting someone else's vulnerability. You also have to be in touch with your vulnerability. You lock it down, you lead to burnout. Again, you say this also beautifully. Um, that is so true for men. And men have even fewer opportunities to be vulnerable in our culture than women. I mean, even among friendships, for example, like women generally have an easier time being vulnerable with friends than men do. So for the men I interviewed, they really do value the care. I mean, to be clear, I selected men who had this experience because I wanted them to model it. I'm not saying this is, sweeping the nation and my work is done here, but I selected men. I wanted to show real men who are changed by care. One of the men I spoke to in the book is a man named Eric, who was in the army for a very long time. So was his wife. When they had kids, they decided he would be the primary parent and she would continue her career in the armed forces. He felt kind of burnt out, and she felt very ambitious and still had a lot of fight in her. And as he says, almost everyone that's in the armed forces been in combat has some version of PTSD. But if you stay in the armed forces, you can channel those rushes of adrenaline and aggression and fear into combat or into competition, basically. Like, even if you're not in active combat, you're doing drills and stuff. Like, you kind of have a place to put all those hard feelings. You go to care, suddenly there's no place to put those hard feelings, and he had to deal with it head on. Something that's really unique about Eric is that his mom ran early childhood care centers on military bases. He was also an army kid. Um, so he had someone tell him care matters. He grew up
Mm.
with books on the importance of, early childhood development around the house. So he had the great privilege and real luck, in my opinion, when you hear the rest of the story, of seeing care as something worthy to invest in and seeing the true value of with children, as it's made clear in my economic chapter. You pay now or you pay more later. And that's not just the parent, that's the whole society. We all invest
Hmm.
together in those kids. So he kind of had that running start to value care. And I wish more men had that running start. But what Eric found is that he knew he had to work hard to really listen to his kids to give them the good care that they needed and deserved and would serve them to grow into good humans in the future. And he found that he couldn't really give them that listening unless he learned to listen to himself. And he had to, through that listening, really come to terms with what his PTSD looked like, what it was doing to him, what his triggers were, how to manage it in a healthy way without relying on drugs that would impede his ability to connect with his kids or maybe not even make him a necessarily safe parent to them. And I think his story just brings up so many threads of what happens when someone that's in hyper masculine spaces enters into that more quote unquote feminine space of care. And also the care's potential to, was it easy for him? Was it always joyful? Not at all. But it pushed him to deal with hard stuff. And, this isn't about men, but quickly I'll speak to myself, and I write about this in the book. Caring for my kids pushed me to grapple with the effects of my parents' divorce and what happened to the parentification that happened to me during that time. And I really never dealt with it before until I was a mom and I had to see myself through the lens of someone who was really caring for, healthy caring, which parentification, it has its goods and its bad. It's not all bad, but that's not a healthy care relationship, generally speaking, all things considered. Suddenly I'm in a healthy care relationship and I realize I can't fix everything for these kids. And when I was a parentified child during my parents' divorce, I kind of did feel like that. I was like, I'm going to make it all better. Here I am. Through care with my kids, I was like, oh, nope, you can't do that. You can never make it all better. And so I really connected with Eric in that sense because I felt like I dealt with some hard psychological stuff through care.
Hmm. Um, yeah, I think that that's so like it's such a helpful modeling and portrayal of that it's possible for men. And that also it requires looking internally. Like that part of the
Yeah.
process is looking internally. Um, I just have one question for you as we're kind of wrapping up. One of the things that's been on my mind as we've been talking is kind of that parenting theory. I don't know exactly what it's called because I'm not a child psychiatrist, but I know that there's this theory how as with parenting and being incredibly inarticulate with parenting, the whole job is not necessary. It's sort of indirect. Like you're creating the environment. You're
Yeah.
not inserting yourself. You're just creating the environment almost like it's like the soil. Like the soil has the nutrients and the plant can grow, but the plant grows
Yeah.
on its own, right? Your job is just not to mess it up and provide the nutrients. And I was imagining that because it sounds like that's what you're saying Eric had to do, to learn to do. And that's what
Yeah,
we all sort of have to learn to do. And in order to do that, we have to face our own past traumas, big T traumas or little T traumas. Because otherwise, if you don't, you are inserting too much of yourself on this child, that the whole thing, like you were talking about with Augie, realizing that your job is to let him become him.
right, exactly.
Um, and that's a healthy care relationship. And same if I'm thinking back to the conversation, the panel um, with that Dr. Allison Applebaum was on, and she's an expert in caregiving stress, especially end of life for medically ill individuals, and talks about her what it was like caring for her father at the end of his life. And that is also its own sort of
Hmm.
um you're holding the frame, and
Exactly.
they are moving through their journey, and your job is to be with. And that is just such that's something that as Americans, like, we have such a hard time with that because
Such a hard time.
we want to control. We want to make it ours. We want to like push forward. Um, so, hmm. Well, Elissa, this has been such a lovely conversation. Thank you for sharing your work and for taking the time to be here. Um, for folks that are listening, again, the book is When You Care. It has a gorgeous cover, by the way. I love the cover. It's always so nice when the book cover comes out amazing.
Yeah, the
It's
designer really, it was the
yes.
first try she knocked
Oh
out of
my
the park,
gosh.
and that was
That's
it. Yeah.
amazing. Can you tell folks where to find you, what you're up to next? Like what tell the people how they can be with you more and hear more of you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at Alyssa Avery. I'm also newly active on LinkedIn, where I've
Mhm.
realized recently that a lot of great generative mom conversations are happening these days. It's a really nice living space. And same on Substack. I have a Substack called Made with Care, where I dig in to the cultural roots of the care crisis, something I will remain passionate about until we can really care for our families without unnecessary burden and stress in this country. And yeah, doing lots of talks for my book, lots of podcasts, and just, feeling like for now I'm going to be hopeful that we're having this care conversation with the wind at our backs, with a good outcome in the election. And, we can keep going with that momentum after November.
Awesome. Well, we will link all of that too. And again, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you.